The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, and Daniel Reeves, a 42-year-old civil engineer and third-generation property owner, read it 3 times before his hands started shaking. The Pinecrest Homeowners Association was informing him that his 2 lakefront cabins, the same cabins his grandfather had built in 1968, the same cabins where Daniel had spent every summer of his childhood, the same cabins he'd painstakingly restored over the last 5 years, had been sold at auction to cover unpaid HOA dues, totaling $847. Daniel had never received a single invoice. He'd never been notified of any debt. And according to the letter, the sale was final. The new owners were taking possession in 48 hours, and he had no recourse. The letter was signed by Margaret Thornhill, HOA president, with a tone so dismissive it felt like a slap. But what Margaret and her board didn't know was that Daniel Reeves wasn't just any property owner. He was a man who understood land surveys, property law, and public records better than most attorneys. And he was about to teach them an expensive lesson about the difference between authority and legality. But tonight, everything was about to change. Before we dive into how Daniel dismantled an entire HOA board and turned their own tactics against them, if you love stories where entitled people face the consequences of their overreach and justice is served with surgical precision, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a property owner past his breaking point, the confrontation where decades of corruption came crashing down, and the resolution where justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with interest. The first part takes you inside Daniel's nightmare as he discovered that the HOA had been systematically targeting his property for years, building a paper trail of fake violations while he worked 60-hour weeks and traveled for his job. You'll feel his disbelief turn to rage as he realized the sale wasn't a mistake. It was theft disguised as procedure. The breaking point came when he stood on his grandfather's porch for what he thought might be the last time, watching strangers measure his windows. That's when something inside him shifted from victim to strategist. The second part is where Daniel walked into the county clerk's office with a leather briefcase full of documents and walked out with ammunition that would make the HOA board wish they'd never heard his name. The moment he laid those property deeds on Margaret Thornhill's desk, watching her face drain of color as she realized what she was looking at, you'll feel the power shift like a physical force. His ultimatum wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The third part is where it all comes together. Lawyers scrambling, board members turning on each other, and a final confrontation in front of 140 homeowners where Daniel revealed exactly how deep the corruption ran. The resolution involves court orders, financial devastation, and a twist so perfectly ironic that it proves karma doesn't just exist. Sometimes it shows up with legal documentation and a smile. Here's exactly how it happened. Daniel Reeves had inherited more than property when his grandfather passed in 2019. He'd inherited a legacy. The 2 cabins on the eastern shore of Lake Pinecrest represented 55 years of family history, summer barbecues, fishing trips with his father, the place where he'd proposed to his wife, where his daughters had learned to swim. At 42, Daniel was a civil engineer who specialized in municipal infrastructure projects, which meant he spent half his life on job sites across 3 states. His profession demanded precision, documentation, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Those same traits would soon become his greatest weapon. He'd bought out his siblings' shares of the inherited property in 2020, then spent 5 years and nearly $200,000 restoring the cabins to pristine condition while maintaining their historic charm. He lived in the larger cabin and rented the smaller one through a property management company during summer months. He paid his property taxes on time, maintained the grounds meticulously, and bothered no one. The cabins weren't part of any HOA when his grandfather built them. They predated the Pinecrest development by 17 years. But developers had built around the original lakefront properties in the 1980s, and the HOA had been trying to absorb the legacy lots ever since. The first incident happened in early March, while Daniel was overseeing a bridge project in North Carolina. He received an email from a neighbor with a photo attached, an orange violation notice stapled to his cabin door, citing unapproved exterior paint color and failure to submit landscaping plans. Daniel stared at the photo in confusion. He hadn't painted anything. His landscaping was native plants that had been there for decades. He called the HOA office and got voicemail. He sent 3 emails over 2 weeks. No response. The notice demanded a $150 fine within 30 days. Daniel paid it, assuming it was some administrative error that he'd straighten out when he returned home. It seemed easier than fighting from 400 miles away. That was his first mistake. The second incident came in June during his daughter's graduation week. Another notice, another fine, this time $300 for unauthorized dock modifications. Daniel didn't have a dock. His property had a small swimming platform his grandfather had anchored in the 1970s. He called again. This time someone answered, a bored-sounding woman named Carol who insisted the violations were on file and properly documented. When Daniel demanded to see the documentation, Carol told him he needed to submit a formal records request in writing. He did. 6 weeks passed with no response. Meanwhile, the fine increased to $450 with late fees. Daniel paid again, his frustration building, but his work kept him away, and he convinced himself it would be resolved when he had time to deal with it in person. The third incident was the breaking point. In late August, Daniel finally returned home for a 2-week break. He walked into his cabin and found it exactly as he'd left it, neat, well-maintained, clearly occupied and cared for. The next morning, he walked outside to find a bright orange notice zip-tied to his mailbox post. Property declared abandoned, scheduled for HOA lien sale September 15th. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Abandoned. He'd been here last month. His renters had been here all summer. His property manager paid all utilities. The notice claimed he owed $847 in accumulated fines and administrative fees. It claimed multiple certified letters had been sent. Daniel had received nothing. He immediately drove to the HOA office, a small building near the development's main entrance. Margaret Thornhill, a severe woman in her late 50s with pearl earrings and a plastic smile, barely looked up from her computer. When Daniel explained the situation, she slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of 3 certified mail receipts, all marked Return to Sender unclaimed. But the address was wrong. They'd been sending everything to 1247 Lakeshore Drive. Daniel's property was 1274 Lakeshore Drive. "That's not my address," Daniel said, his voice steady despite his rising anger. Margaret glanced at the documents, then shrugged. "That's the address on file. You should have updated it." Daniel pointed to his driver's license, his property tax records, his deed, all showing 1274. Margaret's expression didn't change. "The sale is scheduled. If you want to dispute it, you'll need to hire an attorney and file with the county. We're within our legal rights." Daniel stood there, staring at this woman who just told him his family's legacy was being stolen over a clerical error she refused to correct. Something inside him went cold and quiet. Over the next 3 days, Daniel made careful phone calls. The police told him it was a civil matter. A real estate attorney quoted him $5,000 just to start, with no guarantee of success before the sale date. The county clerk's office told him HOA foreclosures were legal in the state if proper procedures were followed. Everywhere he turned, the system told him he was powerless. But Daniel Reeves hadn't built a career on giving up when the ground shifted beneath him. He'd built it on understanding exactly what foundation he was standing on. That night, sitting on his grandfather's porch with a glass of whiskey and a box of old family documents, Daniel made a decision. He stopped hoping someone else would fix this. He stopped expecting fairness from people who'd already shown him who they were. Instead, he opened his laptop and started digging into public records, property law, and the history of every land transaction in Pinecrest going back 60 years. If they wanted to play games with paperwork, he'd show them what games really looked like. And on September 12th, 3 days before the scheduled auction, everything was finally ready. At 8:47 a.m. on Thursday, September 12th, Daniel Reeves walked into the county clerk's office carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to his grandfather, and wearing the same navy suit he wore to project presentations. Inside that briefcase were 43 pages of meticulously organized documents that would blow apart everything the Pinecrest HOA thought they knew about their own authority. The clerk on duty, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd worked in the office for 23 years, recognized him immediately. Daniel had spent the last 72 hours in this building, going through deed records, survey maps, and covenant registrations with the focused intensity of a man who'd found something extraordinary. Patricia had watched his expression change from desperate to determined to something that looked almost predatory. Now he stood at her counter with a calm smile that made her think of a poker player holding a royal flush. "Patricia, I need you to pull the original 1968 property deed for lots 47 and 48 on Lakeshore Drive," Daniel said quietly. "And then I need you to pull the 1985 covenant registration for the Pinecrest HOA. I want to compare the legal descriptions." Patricia didn't ask why. She'd seen enough property disputes to know when someone had found leverage. 20 minutes later, Daniel was sitting in a small conference room with photocopies of documents that confirmed what he'd suspected since discovering a yellowed survey map in his grandfather's papers. The Pinecrest HOA's covenant, filed in 1985, explicitly excluded any properties built before January 1, 1985. His grandfather's cabins, built in 1968, were not, and had never legally been, subject to HOA authority. Every fine, every violation notice, every threatening letter had been issued by an organization with no legal jurisdiction over his property. The HOA had been collecting fees and issuing edicts for nearly 40 years on properties they had no right to govern, and they were about to foreclose on land they'd never had authority over in the first place. But that wasn't the most interesting thing Daniel had discovered. While cross-referencing property records, he'd noticed something peculiar about the HOA office building itself. The structure sat on Lot 12, which, according to original plat maps, had been designated as common area when the development was created. But at some point in 1998, the lot had been reclassified and a building permit issued in Margaret Thornhill's personal name. The HOA office wasn't owned by the HOA, it was owned by Margaret, who'd been charging the association rent for 25 years. Even more interesting, the reclassification had never been properly approved by the county planning board. Technically, the building was unpermitted construction on improperly zoned land. Daniel had made careful notes of every irregularity, every questionable transaction, every missing approval. He'd found the cracks in their foundation. And now he was about to drive a wedge straight through them. At 2:15 p.m. that same afternoon, Daniel walked into the Pinecrest HOA office without an appointment. Margaret Thornhill was behind her desk, typing something on her computer with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd already won. Carol, the administrative assistant, glanced up with mild annoyance. Daniel set his briefcase on Margaret's desk with a solid thunk that made both women look up. "Mr. Reeves," Margaret said with forced patience, "the auction is in 3 days. If you're here to beg for more time," Daniel opened the briefcase and removed a document, sliding it across the desk. "That's the original 1968 property deed for my cabins. Notice the legal description." Margaret picked it up, frowning. "I need you to compare it to this," Daniel continued, placing a second document beside the first. "That's your HOA covenant from 1985. Page 7, Section 3, Subsection B. Read the exclusion clause out loud, please." Margaret's eyes scanned the page. Her face went still. "Properties constructed prior to January 1, 1985 are excluded from covenant authority unless voluntarily annexed through written agreement," she read, her voice flat. Daniel nodded. "My grandfather built those cabins in 1968. I have the original building permits, the survey maps, and county assessor records confirming continuous occupation since construction. I never signed any annexation agreement. Neither did my grandfather, which means every violation notice you've sent me, every fine you've levied, every threat you've made has been issued by an organization with exactly zero legal authority over my property. You've been committing what's called color of law violations. It's a federal offense when you deprive someone of property rights while falsely claiming legal authority." The blood drained from Margaret's face. Carol had stopped typing. The office felt suddenly airless. Daniel wasn't finished. "Here's what happens next. You have 2 options, and I need your decision right now." He pulled out a third document, a formal complaint he'd already prepared for the state attorney general's office. Option 1, I file this complaint, which documents every fraudulent lien, every falsified notice, every dollar you've collected from property owners you had no authority over. I've identified at least 7 other legacy properties in similar situations. The state investigates, the FBI gets involved because this crosses into federal civil rights violations, and you spend the next 3 years explaining to lawyers why you've been running what amounts to an extortion operation. Your personal assets get frozen during investigation. The HOA gets sued into oblivion. You lose everything. Margaret's hands were shaking now. Or option 2, Daniel continued, his voice calm and cold. You cancel the auction immediately. You refund every penny I've paid in bogus fines with interest. You issue a written acknowledgement that my properties were never subject to HOA authority, and you resign from the board effective immediately. Margaret's mouth opened and closed. You can't. This is... Daniel placed one final document on the desk. That's the 1998 permit application for this building. Notice anything missing, like planning board approval, like proper zoning. This entire office is an unpermitted structure on improperly rezoned common land. Land that, by the way, reverts to county ownership if proper use isn't maintained. I've already filed a complaint with the zoning board. They're reviewing it next Tuesday. If you're not cooperative, I'll make sure they know exactly how this building came to exist and who's been collecting rent on property they don't legally own. Margaret Thornhill looked like she might be sick. How did you? Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm a civil engineer, Margaret. I understand infrastructure, permits, and property law better than you understand your own scam. You targeted the wrong property owner. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Finally, Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. What do you want? Daniel's expression didn't change. Everything I just said, in writing. By 5 p.m. tomorrow, or every document in this briefcase goes to the state attorney general, the FBI, and every major news outlet within 100 miles, your choice. He closed the briefcase, lifted it from her desk, and walked toward the door. As he reached it, he turned back. Oh, and Margaret, start looking for a new office, because when the county realizes what you've done here, this building is coming down. Sleep well. The deadline came at 4:47 p.m. on Friday, September 13th, 13 minutes before Daniel's ultimatum expired. Margaret Thornhill arrived at his cabin personally, accompanied by the HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Gerald Pritchard who kept adjusting his tie. Margaret's face was drawn and pale, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. She carried a folder containing everything Daniel had demanded. Cancellation of the auction, signed and notarized. A check for $1,247 covering all fines plus interest. A formal letter acknowledging his properties had never been subject to HOA authority, and her resignation from the board, effective immediately. Daniel examined each document at his kitchen table while they stood in uncomfortable silence. Gerald cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, we hope this resolves the matter to your satisfaction. The board has voted to accept Ms. Thornhill's resignation and implement new procedures for verifying covenant jurisdiction before issuing violations. Daniel looked up slowly. Does the board know why she resigned? Gerald's eyes shifted. She cited personal reasons. Daniel nodded. And the other 7 properties I identified, the other families you've been illegally fining for years. Gerald's face reddened. We're conducting an internal review. That's when Daniel made his move. He pulled out his phone and opened an email draft he'd prepared that morning. This message goes to every homeowner in Pinecrest, all 140 families. It contains scanned copies of the original covenant, highlighting the exclusion clause your board has been ignoring. It includes a list of every legacy property you've targeted. It details exactly how much money you've collected through fraudulent violations. And it explains how Margaret's been charging the HOA rent on a building she doesn't legally own, on land that was never properly rezoned. Gerald went white. Mr. Reeves, that information could destroy the association. Good, Daniel said flatly. You have 48 hours to contact every affected property owner, refund their money, and publicly acknowledge the violations. Or I send this email and you explain to 140 angry homeowners why their dues have been funding Margaret's retirement plan. Your choice. Again. The next 48 hours unfolded like dominoes falling. Margaret issued a formal apology letter that was distributed to all homeowners. The HOA refunded over $30,000 to 7 families who'd been wrongly targeted. Gerald Pritchard recommended the board hire an independent property law firm to audit every violation issued in the last decade. But the real earthquake came on Tuesday, September 17th, when the county zoning board met to review Daniel's complaint about the HOA office building. Daniel attended the meeting personally, dressed in his presentation suit, carrying expanded documentation. He didn't just explain the permit violations. He demonstrated how the unpermitted building had been used to generate personal income for Margaret while claiming tax-exempt status as an HOA facility. The zoning board voted unanimously to revoke the building's occupancy permit, effective in 30 days. But that wasn't the twist that made Daniel smile. When the county assessor reviewed the property records, they discovered that Lot 12, the land under the HOA office, had technically reverted to county ownership in 2015 due to unpaid common area maintenance fees that the HOA had neglected. Margaret had been collecting rent on a building that sat on land neither she nor the HOA actually owned. The county could now dispose of the lot as they saw fit. Daniel had already filed a purchase offer with the county for Lot 12. As the adjacent property owner with historical ties to the area, and as someone who'd just exposed a decade of fraud, his offer received favorable consideration. 2 weeks later, Daniel Reeves became the legal owner of the land where the Pinecrest HOA office stood. The October board meeting was held in the community center instead of the now vacant office building. Daniel attended as a guest, sitting in the back row while 140 homeowners learned the full extent of what had happened. Margaret Thornhill didn't attend. She'd already listed her house for sale and resigned from 3 other community boards. The new HOA president, a retired schoolteacher named Robert Chen, formally apologized to Daniel in front of everyone. "Mr. Reeves could have destroyed this association," Robert said quietly. "Instead, he gave us the opportunity to make things right. I hope we've learned something about the difference between authority and legitimacy." After the meeting, several homeowners approached Daniel. One of them was Elena Martinez, owner of Lot 52, one of the other legacy properties. "You saved my house," she said, tears in her eyes. "They were threatening to put a lien on my mother's property. I didn't know how to fight them." Daniel shook her hand. "You shouldn't have had to fight, that's the point." Another homeowner, a young father named James, asked the question everyone wanted to know. "What are you going to do with the office building?" Daniel had thought about that carefully. "I'm tearing it down," he said. "The building was illegal from the start, but I'm donating the cleared lot back to the county with a conservation easement. It'll be a small lakefront park, open to the public, no fees, no gatekeepers." The small crowd around him erupted in applause. 2 months later, on a cold November morning, Daniel stood on his grandfather's porch with his coffee, watching the sun rise over Lake Pinecrest. The HOA office was gone, replaced by a cleared lot where county workers were planting native trees and installing a small gazebo. His cabin stood exactly as they had for 55 years, unthreatened, unviolated, protected by the same documents his grandfather had carefully filed in 1968. Daniel's daughters visited that weekend, and they spent Saturday afternoon in the new park, feeding ducks near the water's edge where Margaret's office had once stood. His youngest asked why the sign said Reeves Legacy Park. Daniel smiled. "Because your great-grandfather taught me that the most valuable thing you can own isn't property, it's the knowledge to defend it. And because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation." Daniel had learned that justice doesn't always come from lawyers and courtrooms. Sometimes it comes from a civil engineer who knows how to read a survey map, from a grandfather who kept every document, from a man who refused to let entitled people rewrite history. And as he sat there in the peace he'd fought to preserve, Daniel smiled. Because justice, whether served hot or cold, with anger or with patience, was equally satisfying, especially when it came with property deeds, county approval, and the knowledge that the people who'd tried to steal his legacy now drove past a park bearing his family's name every single day. Across the country in Portland, Oregon, a retired aerospace engineer named Dr. Sarah Lynn was opening her mail when she found a demand letter from her condo board. They wanted her to remove her unauthorized satellite equipment within 72 hours or face daily fines. Sarah looked up at her small radio telescope. the same equipment she'd been using for 20 years to volunteer with NASA's citizen science programs, and smiled the way she used to smile before launch sequences. "Unauthorized equipment," she murmured, pulling out the FCC license, the federal telecommunications exemption, and the legal precedent that specifically protected scientific instruments from local restrictions. "Let's see how much they enjoy arguing with federal law." The board president, a man who'd once told Sarah women didn't belong in engineering, was about to get an education in radio astronomy and regulatory authority. But that's a story for another time.